That was great.
Well, thank you all very much. Now comes the dull part of the morning's proceedings, listening to me for a minute or so. It's not going to be nearly as entertaining as what we just had. Thank you all very much, and welcome to day 2 of the Global Innovation Summit. So yesterday we were talking about the importance of serendipity, of trust, of the values of a rainforest. And last night we were talking about issues related to various programs that the World Bank, that entrepreneurship organizations, the Green Growth Institute are promoting to encourage innovation and entrepreneurship. But the question really becomes, how do you go to your communities, wherever they are, whatever country, whatever continent, whatever level of development, and begin to move the culture, begin to engender trust, begin to develop programs that encourage serendipity. And talking to some people last week about the Global Summit, one of the questions that immediately came up from some of our Egyptian colleagues was, if serendipity is so important, how do you develop a government program to encourage serendipity? Isn't that a contradiction? And it is. And that's a challenge. And it's a challenge for all of you. And it's a challenge for organizations like the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and the African Development Bank. How do you do these things? So that's one of the issues we want to discuss. That's the issue, in fact, that we hope to discuss this morning. We'll be having a number of different panels where we'll talk first in broad general terms about the rainforest. Then we'll have some people from enterprises and organizations that are encouraging entrepreneurship, how they're operating. And then we'll also have some people from different countries talking about the programs that they are doing in their countries to develop innovation, entrepreneurship, on the basis of trust, of serendipity, of these values, and sort of really what they are doing to sort of get to that point where what's missing is not money, but trust. And if you develop the trust and you develop the serendipity and you develop the linkages and the networking, then the money will follow. So how do you build these kind of programs? How do you make these sorts of changes? That's on the agenda for this morning, and then we will, of course, continue with some other very interesting related topics later this afternoon. So without further ado, I would like to bring up and invite my colleague, Victor Wang. Victor and Greg, as you know, are the authors of the book that you have in front of you, The Rainforest, and they will begin the discussion of what is the rainforest, what are some ideas for beginning to think about how you change into a rainforest, how you transform society into a rainforest. So I will leave the rest to them, and thank you all very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Al. I should let you know, Al has been a tremendous force behind this. So many people and so many institutions around the world have put so much faith into Al over the years in his role at the World Bank, so it's been a true joy to work with him and to learn from him. So what I want to do today is to talk a little bit about this idea of ecosystems, and then my partner, Greg, will follow to try to talk about some of the implementation issues that a lot of you are dealing with. So I'll talk kind of in concepts and provide a little bit of a framework for how we think about these systems, and then Greg will follow up with what we actually do. And then later on in the morning at your next house session, you'll get a chance to actually start to apply some of these frameworks into your work. So this is an image we've continued to use, which is this idea of a door, and I really think of this as a transformational process because it's about stepping back and thinking about the whole way we've thought of economic development for many years. So to do this, we need some context. So let's look at where we are in history. If we think of the broad sweep of how we think about economics and economic growth, we get a better sense for where we are today and perhaps what we need to do moving forward. One of the great comments yesterday from Gerardo from the World Bank was this notion that all these countries have done what we've asked them to do, and they've kind of gone through the whole checklist, and it's still not happening, right? So something is happening in the way we're approaching the problem that isn't addressing these fundamental issues if they've gone through the whole checklist. So back in 1776, people often call this the start of classical economics, right? This was Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. And the idea was that economic value comes from the cost of the raw inputs. And these were fairly static economic times in England, and so he observed the world in terms of how much you could save on costs that you put as inputs in the system. And he looked at land, labor, and capital as the three primary inputs into economic systems. In 1871, this is the year that people often view as the start of neoclassical economics. There were a series of articles that were written, and this became the start of this idea that it wasn't just what you put into the system, it was also the customers. It was about the supply-demand equilibrium. That is, the match between people supplying stuff and the people who needed stuff on the other side, the people buying it. And that those were always constantly in flux, but over time they would sort of equal out, like water, if you will. And that led to a whole revolution in how we think of economics. In fact, how we think of economics today was a result of, basically a prescriptive, derived prescriptively from neoclassical economics. In 1990, this idea of business clusters started to become popular. First in 1990 was Michael Porter, then 91, Paul Krugman followed it. And the idea was that geographical concentration is what caused economic growth. It had contributed a lot to economic growth, rather. That if you put things close together, it made it easier to find jobs, it made it easier for people to supply one another. And what's happened is that people have been using this model to try to create more innovative growth. They've tried to grow innovation ecosystems by trying to copy this model. But today, as we've talked about, the discussion last night sort of brought home this feeling that it seems unsatisfactory, right? We've got a lot of these models that we've been working on, and none of them seem to address the core issues of what the countries and societies and communities are dealing with today. So the question is, how do we cultivate these systems? Not just describe them. That is, what is the prescription, not just the description? The world is looking for a new framework to accelerate growth. So if you look across this sweep from 1776 to 1871 to 1990, we seem to be here today, in 2012. And what's interesting is that we all sort of feel that there's something missing, and it's been hard to try to articulate what that missing thing has been. This model that we've used for economics so far has led to this kind of thinking, right? This is the assembly line process, and this is a very important part of economics. It's about saving money, it's about efficiency, it's about operating companies at scale. And this model that people use to make widgets, starting in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, is not that different from what we do today. This is what they do today to make electronics, right? Highly precise, calibrated processes for making stuff that's very predictable and organized. And we do this not just for hard physical goods, but we do this for ideas as well, right? The whole cubicle culture, in many ways, is derived from this assembly line model, which is how do we create things in very controlled, predictable patterns, including people and the knowledge they create. But what we'd like to propose is this new paradigm for innovation, which is instead of this controlled process, like a plantation or a farm, we start thinking of things in terms of these serendipitous systems, like rainforests. And if you think of a farm, what you're looking to do is to try to build a crop that you're anticipating, right? And this is how we think of all economic activity in terms of large companies and production. And you see this, a lot of countries try to copy this model of production. And it'll be the crop that you planted. If you're trying to plant corn, you plant corn, and then you try to use better seed, you use better fertilizer, you use better watering systems, you try to precisely calibrate the amount of corn you can produce per area of land. In rainforests, however, it's what's unpredictable. So whereas in farmland and plantations, if you have a weed, something that you didn't expect, you would kill it, right? You'd use some Roundup, you'd use something that would remove that unexpected thing. But in rainforests, the weeds are the things that become the most valuable assets. If you look at companies like Facebook, not that long ago, maybe 6 years ago, Facebook was a weed. It was this unpredictable thing. I still remember when folks in Silicon Valley were starting to talk about this company, and there were a lot of skeptics, right? And so those of you who watched the movie last night, Something Ventured, you realize it's not so obvious what's going to be a winner in the very beginning. These things are highly unpredictable. And so the conclusion we can draw is that while plants are harvested most efficiently on farms, the weeds sprout best in rainforests, which is that things that are very controlled are done well in operations where that's the purpose of what you're trying to make, is kind of a predictable output. But the things that are unexpected come from these highly chaotic environments. So the question is, how do we mash them up together? And these types of ecosystems are highly complex, and what we found about rainforests and these innovation ecosystems is that they're places that nurture these types of serendipitous interactions, right? If great value comes out of unpredictable systems, then what is the nature of these systems that nurture these serendipitous interactions? This type of ecosystem, whether it's ideas and inventions, the money, the talent, the coaches, all these different pieces of this, they all feed together into the process. And when sitting here in Silicon Valley today, you look around, and this place has been very, very good at nurturing this kind of activity in the human community. So this requires this radical shift in perspective, right? If you look at the sweep of economic thinking for years, it was this idea that all of the factors of economic production, land, labor, capital, and arguably technology, as some folks have argued in the last 20 years, it goes into this economic system, kind of like a black box. And if you look at a lot of the models that people have used in centrally planned economies, it's like this. In fact, they plan it this way. And it kind of goes into this big box, and out comes economic output. But the real world is really not like that at all, right? The real world has real human beings. It doesn't have gears. It's kind of an unpredictable black box. So that land is actually managed by a landlord, potentially. The labor is controlled by an engineer who can allocate his or her time. The capital is managed by an investor who can decide what to do with it. And the technology is invented by a scientist who often has the ability to decide what to do with that as well. So somehow those people are sitting in between those factors of production and the output in these systems, right? Because they control them. And this has been lost, really, in the way we've looked at the growth of these economic systems since the very beginning. And real human beings, they don't just sit there and magically create stuff. They're separated, right? They're inherent bottlenecks into the human process. People are separated by geography, by distance, by culture, by language, by social networks, and by lack of trust, right? We create walls around ourselves, just naturally. It's biological, right? We tend to huddle with people we're closest to, and we tend to distrust or have our defenses up for people that we don't know or are distant from us. This is very, very natural, but it's human nature. And so something about these systems, like places like Silicon Valley, have found ways to overcome these bottlenecks, or if not entirely, at least to reduce them, at least to lower those walls. In most places around the world, and we've done work in places from the Middle East to Latin America, those walls in many places tend to be quite high, naturally, but unless you're talking to your close friends or your close family members. Otherwise, the walls are very difficult to surmount. And this happens across entire systems, across entire economies. It's not as if these walls are easy to breach. They're big, and they multiply across entire communities. Some of you may recognize this woman. This woman just passed away not that long ago, just a few weeks ago, Elinor Ostrom. She was the first woman who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009. And she was also not an economist. She was a political scientist, a political economist, rather. And what she proved, not just in theory, she actually proved that zero-sum games can indeed become positive-sum games. And this is very interesting, right? Because all those economic models we looked at before, from the classical school to the neoclassical school, even to the cluster-based school, have at least some sort of premise that things are at war. People are at war with each other. And what Elinor Ostrom did is she said, well, that doesn't seem like it makes sense. And she went and she looked at all these finite resource pools around the world. So she looked at forests, she looked at lakes, she looked at irrigation systems. And these are places where if people are at war with each other, they're fighting, if they were in these zero-sum games where they had walls around and they didn't trust one another, the economists predicted that this stuff should have just been used up because people would fight and they'd extract as much as they could out of the systems. And she found that wasn't the case. In fact, when people were able to communicate with each other, the higher the level of communication, the higher level of trust within the communities to use these resources, whether it's taking lumber out of forests or taking fish out of lakes or using irrigation systems, you could actually create win-win games. People actually created productivity when they were able to communicate and collaborate together. She documented this, right? And this flew in the face of everything that had happened in economic thinking up till this point. So the secret of these systems has to be this, which is that economies thrive in this innovation sphere when culture overcomes these social barriers and fosters connectivity, trust, and collaboration between diverse people. It has to be, right? That's all that's left. And it's not as if we're just making this up. Elinor Ostrom actually went in and actually demonstrated this happening in several different isolated communities around the world. So the question then is, how do we design these networks where value comes from chaos? Indeed, can we engineer serendipity? Can we make things that are unpredictable happen better? A lot of people have talked about creative destruction for many years. This is Schumpeter's model about a century ago, that somehow economies would thrive when you had the willingness to destroy things, right? And this has become a lot of the basis of free market thinking. I just read something yesterday saying innovation comes from creative destruction. Well, for those of you who have built companies before, you know it's a lot easier to destroy a company than to build a company, right? I used to be a lawyer. You could take a company through bankruptcy within a few weeks, maybe a few months if you had to, right? You could destroy a company literally almost overnight. Building that same company is so hard and can take years and decades to put together. So it's not just creative destruction, it's this process of creative reassembly, which is how people assemble together. So the problem is not of factors of production, it's about the nature we organize ourselves into communities. How do we put together companies efficiently with minimal costs, minimal transaction costs in the process? Why did this happen in Silicon Valley? Well, one of the reasons it happened is this idea of the frontier. And people talk about this a lot, but the frontier wasn't just about individualists, right? We often have this image of cowboys as being, individualists who didn't care about communities or anybody else around them. But in the American frontier, we actually find, if you look at the history, that communities were built on the frontier instantaneously because people had to trust each other fast or they died. People would often meet in Independence, Missouri when they were heading out to about 150 years ago to the frontier, and they would form wagon trains of people, 150 people, 200 people, within the span of days, people they'd never met. And if they didn't form these trains, they would die in the process of trying to move out to the frontier. So built into the system of the West Coast was this idea that you couldn't depend on your family, you couldn't depend on your close neighbors and friends because you didn't have any more. You didn't have them with you. You had to essentially become friends fast with the people that you were with, that you had to rely on. And you see this very, very commonly in Silicon Valley, right? People can be sitting in a coffee shop one day, and the next day they could be doing business together. In fact, a number of the people involved in helping put this conference together were people we just met randomly in the process. One person was sitting next to us at a coffee shop and said, "Hey, I'd like to get involved in your conference." And here we are today. So if you look at the American frontier and you look at places like the Valley and you look at other economic systems that are highly productive, you find there are certain rules. We call them the rules of the rainforest. And they're all there. We're not going to state anything for people practicing in these communities that's radical, but for people that aren't in these communities, these are really, really hard to do. So number one, break rules and dream, which is this idea that what was established before isn't necessarily precedent, and that you should push boundaries, right? That this is inherent in human nature, that you can actually do this. And if you think about kids do this all the time. It's just that when we become adults, we start to think this is really foolish. Rule number two, you open doors and listen. That is, be open-minded to others, because you don't know what they've got to offer. On the frontier, this mashup of different types of people became necessary to your survival. You had to find who was a good shot with a gun, who was good at taking care of livestock, right? Who was good at cooking food. And the ability to pool these teams together very, very quickly became critical to survival. Trust and be trusted. So one thing you find in a lot of places is that trust becomes kind of a quid pro quo arrangement. Like, well, I'll trust you, but only if you trust me first. And this happens a lot, especially in business. When you're starting to talk about money and livelihood and what people's dreams and passions, it's very, very easy for trust to become this finite resource that people clutch very tightly. But what you find in places like the Valley is people give it first. It's very interesting. When you can approach almost anyone, including a lot of famous people in the Valley, and just say, "I need some help." And they'll just give it to you because they trust you first, and they'll trust that somehow you'll reciprocate and you'll give it back. Now, this isn't always the case. There are plenty of people in all areas of human activity that aren't trustworthy. But by and large, we're talking about the overall thrust of a community. Experiment and iterate together, which is this idea that you don't control and predict what you're going to do in advance. You start testing it out, right? You don't know if it's going to work. Every single startup company never becomes what you think it's going to be, right? The business plan changes, the people change, everything changes. And this model of adaptation has actually been key to the process of creation in places like the Valley. And it's also been key to biological systems, right? Alex Dagan was talking last night about the nature of biological systems. It was the recombination, the constant variance that caused productivity in biological systems. This idea of seeking fairness and not advantage. This was very profound because if in the film last night, there was this instance where Arthur Rock was talking about creating Intel with Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce. And they just said, "Well, how much of the company do you want to give up?" And they said, "Well, how about half?" And they said, "Okay." right? And you don't see that conversation happen in almost any other form of economic activity, right? It becomes this constant negotiation, a battle between investors and startup companies. And this idea that, sure, why not half, is very, very interesting. And it's this idea that, well, we're all in this together, and we all need to kind of share some kind of fair stake in this enterprise we're putting together. And this idea of error, fail, and persistence, that is, making mistakes is okay, failing is okay. And this is very hard in many parts of the world, because failure can basically ruin your career, your livelihood, your family reputation for a generation. And pay it forward, this idea that you give it back into the system. One of the things you'll find in the startup business is that everyone's willing to help you. It's very, very surprising to people who aren't from this community, but you can get advice and help from almost anybody if you approach them in the right way and you're asking the right questions. If you just have to send a really interesting email, and you can probably get a response from almost anyone that you can think of in these types of communities. So then the question goes to, how do humans change behavior, of course? And this is a very difficult question. If you look at the work of psychologists over the years, one of the things that has actually shown to change human behavior has been this process of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, what they find is people change behavior by doing, by actively testing out behaviors against the real world. And that by being aware of the response you're getting from the behaviors you do, then you actually adjust. And the reason CBT has been so powerful is because it actually works, and it reflects the way we learn in real life. We learn in real life when we just do stuff, and you see for yourself what actually works and what's productive. So the only way to build these systems then has to be real doing. And so if you look at, we created a set of tools, and these tools all reflect this idea of doing, active practice, being aware of what's happening in the system. So you learn by doing. There's no passive learning in building innovation ecosystems. We're creating systems where people are actively building a company, they're inventing a product, they're commercializing an idea. You enhance diversity. So the greatest power in these systems is to lower these walls that divide human beings. And so diversity means that people more distant from you are those people that you inherently are less likely to trust, but those people are whom you can create the most interesting opportunities, right? The people that, a scientist and a business person. Some of you have actually tried to put together a scientist and a business person together because you see that there's an opportunity. And what happens? 99.9% of the time, they can't stand each other, they don't understand each other, they hate each other, and usually nothing comes out of that effort, right? So there's inherent bottlenecks in getting very, very diverse people to interact and collaborate. But you have to have that happen. You have to get them in front of each other, and you have to find ways for them to overcome these barriers. The way people learn is by emulating role models and through peer interaction. So one of the things that happens, and this is something that psychologists have proven, right? It's our ability to mirror the behavior of others. And so you find, for instance, in the Middle East, right, the example of Maktub, the company that was acquired by Yahoo, has been transformative because suddenly all these entrepreneurs think, wow, a generation ago that would have been nuts, but not that long ago you saw this actually happen. People can actually build companies and make them very successful. Then build tribes of trust, so building communities. And this is one thing we've tried to do here at this conference is to say, look, there are ways to do this. There are actually tools you can use to create communities where people actually start to trust one another. And this is something we've learned from a lot of the people in design thinking who've actually talked about the nature of setting up human interaction, setting the stage to foster the kinds of interaction that are highly desirable. The other thing is creating social feedback loops. This is something Eleanor Ostrom talked about, which is people need to be able to know who's behaving by the rules and who's not. And when you have social feedback loops, which is these systems that allow people to communicate whether they're following the rules or not, or who's doing good and who's not doing good, that it's like a karma account, right? People know who's paying back into the system, who's obeying the system, who's following the system. And these communities, if you looked at the movie last night, you saw these venture capitalists. They all had to work together all the time, right? It was a fraternal group. And so that nature of these highly, highly tight social networks means it's not that the networks are tight that matters necessarily, so much as the fact that if you misbehave, people know about it immediately. And then making these social contracts explicit. That is, not just making them kind of silent, but when you start to say, look, this is the social contract, this is what we're supposed to do, it's easier for people to follow. That's just inherent in human nature. So what does it mean? when you boil it down and you actually look at how do we behave, we'll contrast the old world with the new world. So the old world was factors of production: land, labor, capital, and maybe technology. In this new system, and this thinking about innovation ecosystems, it's about cultural transformation. It's about changing human behavior fundamentally in these types of innovation groups. Instead of thinking of clusters, technoparks, and incubators, we start thinking about human connectivity, not just physical proximity. Physical proximity in a different era was basically a substitute for human connectivity. But we don't have to think that way anymore. We are fortunate enough where we're living in a time where human connectivity can actually cross geographical boundaries. So how do we build these bonds that connect very, very disparate parts of the human ecosystem together? Whereas in the old world, we thought of local first and then global. In the local communities, in the old world of thinking of startups, and you still see this happen a lot in economic development, is they'll tell startup companies, well, start locally, prove it, build your company with some local advisors, start with some local testing, start with local customers, and then if it really works, then you can go global, right? But this doesn't really work anymore. It's really about wherever the value chain goes, wherever you need to go to bring together the best advisors, the best investors, the best customers, the best suppliers in the world, do it. Instead of venture capital as being merely the process of writing small checks, it's about the fund managers and the human qualities that they possess, because human qualities actually matter in this. A fund manager is not just a fund manager. They become a stakeholder. They become a partner in the process of enterprise building. Instead of hiring by just skills and resume, which is what you see a lot. You see this happen in government programs for economic development all over the world, which is they look for skill bases. But they don't think about the people themselves and who are they? Character, trust, respect. Are they role models? Right? This stuff matters because the cost, the difficulty of doing innovative activity is usually what eats up the process. So if you've got people that actually become part of the problem, then it kills the opportunity. You need people that actually foster the growth of these entire communities. They change the way these systems and communities behave. Instead of planning for specific outcomes, you experiment, adapt, and iterate. And instead of measuring raw output, which is the way we've looked at these systems for so long, you start to measure the environment itself, right? Sometimes what you're trying to measure is not always easily measured by looking directly at it. Sometimes you look to the side. And so if you look at these environments, you actually realize the output flows from these environments. When you look at output, it's like trying to look at the flowers in a field instead of measuring the quality of the earth underneath, right? And when you look at the quality of the earth, the quality of the soil, and the environment around it, you realize it doesn't matter if the flowers happen to be in season. It just matters if the environment is capable of sustaining flowers over time. And this is a very, very different way of looking at innovation. And it's something to which we don't have all the answers, right? We know that the environments matter. How to actually measure them is something that we need to figure out. So rainforests thrive ultimately by nurturing what makes us uniquely human, right? Which is very, very different than the old economic models of the past. The old economic models were about overcoming what we thought were the bad aspects of human nature, right? Our randomness, our unpredictability. But innovation itself actually relies on that and thrives on it. So it relies us to do things that make us laugh, that make us happy, that make us cry, and that make us love. Innovation itself really relies, and it relies on what makes us happy to be alive. Because if you're not having fun, if you're not doing something that you enjoy, it's frankly not worth it. Innovative activity is just too hard. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Next, I'm going to introduce Greg Horowitz, my colleague, who will talk about some of the practical implementation steps that we've used in developing these systems.
So that was a great setup. Victor did a great job of setting us up for the next part. But he was too easy on you guys. Sorry. So we're going to make you work a little bit. There's going to be a test here. Hey, you didn't think there was going to be one this early in the morning. Or am I supposed to point this? There we go. Question for you. 20 years from now, what do you think will be the most disruptive technology we will be working with? What will be the next Google, the next Facebook, even perhaps the next Instagram? Wow, have you heard me talk? The answer is we actually don't know. In fact, there's probably a pretty good chance that the technology that will be that disruption hasn't even been thought of yet. Perhaps even the person who's going to develop it hasn't been born yet. That presents us with a pretty good challenge. If we don't know what these technologies and these ideas are going to be, how do we build systems to support them? How do we build a workforce capable of creating the jobs that will do this? And the answer is you have to build these systems that are highly flexible, but most important, highly responsive. And so that's what we kind of do in the rainforest. But before we can do that, we actually have to do some unlearning. So the first step we do when we go in and work with regions is we help them unlearn. The way we grow our knowledge is we take a piece of information and we connect it to an experience and context, and then we shelve it away as memory. But if we create those wrong relationships, then every time we recall it, we will recall it incorrectly. That's why when we go into places and we talk about innovation, we talk about commercialization, technology transfer, all these words, we're probably using them differently. Definitions really matter, and we need to make sure that we are aligned in the definitions, and part of that is actually doing the unlearning. You have to look at this as software and hardware, that although many species are completely hardwired to adapt and respond, we have the ability to change our software, and that's what we really need to focus on. And we need to go from this notion of scarcity to abundance. So here's what I'm going to propose, is that we actually look at this as a new paradigm. Yesterday, Phil was talking about looking at the ecosystem from the canopy. And he says, all you really see when you get up there in the canopy are these large companies, and very often you can't see what's beneath them. Well, one of the attributes of these very, very large companies is that they're built to predict and repeat. Figure out what they do well, do it better and better, become more creative, more productive, more efficient. But in small startup companies, it's all about learning and adapting, creating small little steps, getting that knowledge, and responding quickly. We actually need to move from business planning to business modeling. The way we teach in our business schools, we actually need to create e-schools, entrepreneurship schools. Very, very different than business schools. We need to teach entrepreneurs how to manage cash flow, not necessarily how to spend all their time creating budgets. And that is a key fundamental of business planning versus business modeling. And what you will see in the Rainforest Canvas was actually taken from the idea of business modeling. And of course, everyone thinks it's about eliminating risk. You know, if we can just get the risk down to zero, we have the most efficient system. But in these innovation systems that are constantly moving, you will never be able to remove all the risk. It's not possible. So what makes a good entrepreneur is not the fact that he's risk averse. He just has really good strategies to manage a risk, but he's also very, very risk aware. And of course, we want people, we say never fail, but actually we want them to fail fast and cheaply is the mantra. And we're going to actually close with our ideas on that. And of course, our outputs are not the same things as outcomes. Patents are not products. So very often what we measure as innovation is incorrect. And so we need to think differently about how we measure and what we measure. And last one is just because you invented it, it is not innovative. The market will tell you if it's innovative. And the market will validate it in the form of a social or an economic metric. So you get another question now. Which came first? The chicken or the egg? Oh, God, everyone hears that. So you're absolutely right. The nest. And if we focus on building the nest, which is what we do when we build these rainforests, we focus on the infrastructure. We focus on the platform on which we can build everything. And this is what allows us to be highly flexible. But in these rainforests, there are some things that happen in it that go against our nature. One is that innovation cannot happen unless we have ambiguity and discomfort. Two things that nobody likes. And actually, when we go through these rainforest exercises with regions, this is what totally puts us sideways in the initial phases. That everyone gets very uncomfortable because as we ask more questions, they realize they know less than what they thought they did. And so you have to have a place that allows for ambiguity and discomfort, because that's where all the good stuff comes. And then on top of that, you layer the fact is that the best answers come from when you put people who are uninformed but intelligent in the room. And that goes against conventional wisdom, because you would think that you'd want to go to experts. But what happens is if you always go to experts, you're going to get exactly the same answers every time. And they may be good answers, but you're going to get the same behavior. So if you want to change things and you want to change the paradigm, you get people who are uninformed and intelligent. Because as we were saying yesterday, It's not so much that you get people to think outside the box, it's getting people to realize that the box does not exist. So before we build these systems, you have to have roots before branches. So often when countries come to us to help them, they want to build incubators, they want to build buildings, they want to jump right to building the branches of the tree. And we have to help them understand that you have to build the root system first, because that's what's going to sustain it. And just as in agriculture, if you have a shallow root system, you'll have a system that is not as strong. So this is what we see as the roots of the rainforest. You have to have enlightened government with enlightened policies, smart policies. Now, so often governments come to us and they want us to give them advice on what new policies they should create to foster innovation, to help entrepreneurs be successful. But really, the first thing we actually need to do is look at what policies are already in place that are already in conflict or inhibit the process of innovation. The other thing about these systems is we have to break down social and professional hierarchies. The reason that places like the Silicon Valley, like Israel, are so successful is because they have systems to where knowledge travels in the most efficient path. It's kind of like water. It needs to travel at the easiest path. And if we work in systems that are highly permission-based, you slow down the flow of knowledge. You have to have an engaged private sector. The private sector must be engaged. Otherwise, it's not going to be sustainable. We can use government as a catalyst, and government can participate in these things, but the private sector has to share the risk, but also share the rewards of what happens. You have to have a responsible and responsive workforce, because if you just focus on the entrepreneurs and you create them, once they need resources, if you don't have the workforce to help them, they then move. And we've actually experienced this firsthand with some of our portfolio companies. And of course, universities are not only the generator of great ideas, but they're also the generator of the greatest IP, which is the talent that they produce. And so you have to have a university-industry interface to where industry can have communications with academic institutions so they can describe the kinds of problems they're facing, and then academia can then help them solve it. And when you have a porous interface like that, you get increased innovation happening. You have to get your youth involved. I live in San Diego, which is, by most counts, incredibly innovative city. We have a wonderful workforce. And I sit on the board of the Economic Development Corporation, groups like Connect, and you look around the table, and everyone's over 50 years old. And so many people have gray hair, and they're the heads of the banks, and the heads of the chambers of commerce, and the heads of the large utilities. What we need to do is you need to get your youth involved. They think, as we heard last night from the Something Ventured, when they talked about Steve Jobs, they said he was really weird. He was socially awkward, and he offended people, and he smelled bad. What's interesting is those are the disruptors. You have to get the youth engaged in what you're doing. You have to listen to them. And you've got to create a system that allows things to move, that the knowledge that you have at the top can filter to the bottom, but also the knowledge that's being created at the bottom from these people has to be able to filter to the top. It's kind of like a snow globe. And you have to have flexible but strong intellectual property frameworks, and you have to have an infrastructure that supports. You have to have smart capital. And what we mean by smart capital, it's not just money we put into companies. The reason venture works is because we, as venture capitalists, actually have something valuable to add to the equation. We help these companies grow, and we have networks. We have access to talent and resources. What we find is that mentorship is absolutely critical to the process of companies growing. When we go into regions and we ask them, how many of you have been mentored in your lives and how many of you have acted as mentors? You'd be surprised in many of these places how that just is not an implicit behavior within these economies. And yet within ours, we not only tend to give pay forward in the forms of helping others, but in forms of this mentorship, people who give of their times and are not necessarily compensated, but because they want to inspire and help the next generation. And of course, you then have to build these social mechanisms to get people together. You have to create venues which allow people to get together and share risk together. And most importantly, you must celebrate success. And you have to work closely with media and journalists. You have to work closely with policymakers, because entrepreneurship is very often about role models. And you have to tell their stories. You have to inspire the next generation of what you're doing. Then you have to get everyone at the table. And this is who's at the table. And this is just a quick example. And across the top is actually what they contribute, what they not only can put into the pot, but what they can take out of the pot. And what you find is that if you were to create this little map and put it, you'd find actually where you had some gaps. But you want to put people in there who are different. And what I said yesterday is absolutely true, that you really should appreciate the diversity in this room. Very often when you go to these conferences, you'll go to a conference where there's just policymakers, or just investors, or just entrepreneurs. But the fact is, we have such an eclectic group here, and the reason we're going to be able to do great ideas here is because of that diversity. So now we get into actually what this Rainforest Canvas is. Many of you have heard about it, you've read the book, you're working actually on your innovation plans at your desk, and this tells you a little bit about it. And so we think of this as a regional genome. And the region can actually be defined different ways. It could be a corporation, it can actually be your table. It's whatever you define it to be. And it's wherever you have a critical mass around the resources you need to come up with those ideas. But just as in your own genome, there are going to be those things that you cannot change. Your height, your weight. But there are also going to be those things that you can change. You can influence. Behaviors, how you reach out to others. And you really need to map it exactly the same way that we map our genome. And so we see that there's a confluence of ideas and capital and talent that come together to create innovation, but we need to kind of pull it together. And Matt Ridley, in his book, The Rational Optimist, said, innovation is all about ideas having sex. And you need to promote promiscuity. So that's what we need to do. And in that, we're going to use this system to do it. And we use a design thinking framework. And what was interesting is that a conversation that I happened to be part of a few years ago was with Sanjay Jha, the CEO of Motorola Mobility. And I was listening to him speak, and he was talking about the creation of the droid. And he could not figure out why everyone was so enamored with the iPhone. He said it was inferior in so many ways. And yet, everyone wanted it. They were passionate about it. And you could give them something superior, and they did not want it. So he gave the iPhone to his engineers, and he said, figure out what makes this thing tick and why people like it. And from that knowledge, they created the Droid, the first Android platform, and nobody wanted it the way they wanted the iPhone. And he was still puzzled. Why would someone want something that wasn't as good? And then it dawned on him a few years later that the reason that happened is because he approached the problem incorrectly. What he did is he started with the problem and gave it to his engineers, and his engineers gave it to their designers. But Steve Jobs turned it on its ear. He saw everything as a design problem. He gave it to his designers first, and then they engineered it. So we have used the same approach, where we think that a lot of the problems we need to solve are actually design problems, and from there we can engineer the systems from the design. So this is the process we use. The questions are meant to stimulate thought, and actually the questions are probably more important than the answers, because the questions will lead to more questions, and the questions will be unique depending on your circumstances at the table. But what we need to do is first gather information in the assessment phase, then decide how you're going to design your systems, then we're going to build them together, we're then going to watch them really carefully, and we're going to iterate as necessary. And of course, this did not come out because when they translate, I don't know why, it flipped this. But luckily, every one of you actually has this. This is the Rainforest Canvas. And for some reason, it does it when they switch between systems. But this is kind of a cool thing. And if you kind of look at your systems, which you've got in front of you, you'll see there's a set of boxes. We created these actually to capture ideas. And what we did is we came up with the main themes that you need to think about. Things like, who are the leaders and champions in your community? Who are the people who are going to then take these ideas and take them forward? These are people of influence, of integration, of impact, and integrity. And they're not the usual suspects. Do not necessarily think of them as the president of the country or the head of a utility or the president of a bank. These are a lot of names that you may not even know. In San Diego, where we did it, the people who were responsible for the growth of the cluster were not household names. People who are famous today, like Irwin Jacobs of Qualcomm, back in the 80s, no one knew who they were. And so find who these people are. You have to have a set of activities. What are you doing now to support entrepreneurship? How do you get people together? What are your frameworks? These are the policies, the regulations, the laws that people have to operate in. Because until we put all of our ideas in this, you won't really know how to examine them. And as I said, it's the questions that are actually more important than the answers. They're going to stimulate your thought. They're going to get you to think differently. As we talked about the unlearning phase, the process of asking questions will help you think differently, which will help you learn differently. Then from there, what would we do? So you're taking this stuff. We have to create a roadmap. We then have to take all that knowledge, that assessment that we did, and then we have to design and build your system. And again, this is just a way to gather all of these assumptions and push them into this roadmap. And what we do is going to look very, very messy. You're going to see a lot of ideas on there, and you're going to have to prioritize these in some ways. And so we have a system for prioritization. We use these kind of very quick, what we call micrometrics. And there's usually three. They're thumbs up, thumbs down type of metrics. One is around culture. It says, does the current system allow the behaviors to do this stuff? Or do we have to change people's behaviors in order for them to behave in this way? The second one is political frameworks. Do our existing policies and frameworks allow people to do this, or do we have to change the laws within the place? And the third is around resources. Do we even have the resources to do these activities, or do we have to bring them in? And even more importantly, does this activity we're doing, does it have the ability to actually increase the amount of resources, create resources? And then from there, we can begin to prioritize, and you can see that what we can do early on can create some early traction, early visibility, early wins, and then we can layer in the hard stuff. And then what's really important is you have to be able to measure and listen to what you're doing. You have to be able to create, as Victor said, these feedback loops. And these feedback loops are really important because what we suspect is that really innovation is about three fundamental laws. One is the velocity of capital, the other is the velocity of knowledge, and this third is the absorption and diffusion rate. So there's a lot of places we work with that have lots of money, lots of ideas. That is not the purview of only the Silicon Valley. You know, there's a lot of places that have it. What differentiates us is how well it flows. And can we then measure this flow rate? Right now, our typical metrics are it's equivalent to measuring someone's height and weight. What I'm proposing is, can we measure the heart rate and blood pressure of the system? Can we actually see how this moves? And the answer is absolutely. We're working with our colleagues at Stanford and a few private companies to actually look at what are the proxies for these measurements of flow. How do we actually measure trust in a system? Because trust is a transaction cost. It's a friction within the system. And so it's really important. And once we have that knowledge, how do we then iterate? We create the feedback loops, and then we take that knowledge and create the system. So one thing you're going to realize about any of these maps, these may look like a snapshot at what you're doing today, but they're living, breathing documents. Every time you revisit it, it will look different than the time before. And it's based on not only the new knowledge you have, but it's also based on time in general. So these are just some pictures. We're closing up. We did one of these workshops a few weeks ago in Italy. This is the Italian rainforest. We've done these rainforests in a number of places. Some of our colleagues from the Italian rainforest are actually here in the room. Oh, Gianluca's back there. In fact, Gianluca's name on there, and he's got you can chat with him about it. And these are some pictures from it. So this is the active process that you are actually going through at your tables. We got people going up and putting pictures on. This is kind of what it looks like when we get it all. And then we have to actually take it from there to the next step. So this is my closing thought for you, that the thing we want to realize is that we have to build systems where you can try fast, learn quickly, fail small, and rapidly evolve. So many regions we go to say, God, we just do not have a risk-taking culture. We do not accept failure. You have to create systems that allow for small failures. It's not because you don't like failures. It's just that it hurts too bad when you fall from 2 stories off the ground. But if you fall 2 inches off the ground, it hurts a lot less. So that's why we like people to fail small, fail quickly, and use this rainforest to design the systems that will allow people to do that. And so thank you very much.